You're traveling through the unknown, a journey beyond the corners of reality, where the shadows whisper and the chill runs deep. Welcome to the dimension where your deepest fears are given form. This is the Midnight Mystery.
You may have heard about the Dandy Corporation's modern-day ghost towns. A company as large and as long-lasting as Dandy Company is bound to make a few mistakes, and when they do, it's often cheaper to just ignore them than to throw good money after bad. One such misstep was the Pirates Atoll resort in the Caribbean. It didn't start as a ghost town, of course. Cruise ships would drop hundreds of passengers off at the resort to relax in luxury. The resort had a tiki bar, a small collection of exotic animals, and daily live pirate shows. You can find these facts and even a few photos if you know where to look it up. Dandy Company blew over $30 million on the project. That's not a typo. $30 million. Then, without warning, they completely abandoned it. Blame was placed on the cruise lines, which were contracted to provide a licensed Dandyland theme. Apparently, they tried to renegotiate fees in a predatory manner. They knew the resort would be useless without the ships, and that Dandy had a lot to lose. Local staff on the island were also blamed for showing up late and having a poor work ethic. That's where the truthful nature of the story ends. It wasn't because of greedy cruise lines, and it most definitely wasn't because those dang foreigners are so lazy. No, I very sincerely doubt that those excuses hold water. Why? Because of Primevere's Palace, near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Dandy began construction of Primevere's Palace in the late 1990s. Conceptually, it was going to be a lush medieval forest. The aforementioned palace would sit at the center and house the guests. If you're unfamiliar with the titular character, you may remember the classic story, The Noble and the Knave. However, most people probably know her from the decades-old Dandy cartoon of the same name. Primevere is a young lady from a royal family, exiled into the primitive wilderness by a cruel nobleman. There, she befriends various woodland creatures before being rescued by a reformed highwayman. Primevere's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the very beginning. Dandy bought out a ton of high-priced land for the project, and scandal surrounded some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then immediately sold them to Dandy Company. One home had just finished construction when it was immediately condemned with no real explanation. The land that had been seized was supposedly intended for some sort of highway project. Knowing full well that this was a lie, people started calling it Lemming Lane, a play on their mascot, Lucky Lemming, and the legend that the creatures took paths to their own demise. Then, there was the concept art. A few stuffed shirt types from Dandy Company held a city meeting. They intended to convince everyone that this project was going to benefit them. It would increase tourism, bringing extra customers to local businesses. They revealed the concept art with a flourish and accompanying upbeat music, sure it would impress their audience. When people saw the garish Technicolor eyesore of a building, the surrounding tribal wilderness, and staff members dressed in wild, savage loincloths and masks, suffice to say everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a magical castle of sorts, an arcane forest, and half-naked servants. Not only would this be in the center of a relatively wealthy historic area, but also one below the Bible Belt. Magic, talking animals, and exposed skin were highly controversial at that point in time. One crowd member stormed the stage, in fact, managing to break a presentation board over his knee. Dandy took the community and essentially broke it over their knee in response. Houses were razed to the ground. Land was cleared. There wasn't a damned thing anyone could do or say about it. Local television stations and newspapers were against the building of the resort at first. Then, some corporate connections between Dandy Co.'s media holdings and the local news venues came into play. Their opinions soon turned on a dime. But I digress. Remember Pirates Atoll in the Caribbean? Dandy sunk all that money into it, then split at the first sign of trouble. The same thing happened with Primevere's Palace. Construction was completed, and visitors stayed at the resort with little to no problems. The smaller surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances that came with an influx of lost and cranky travelers. Then, it all just stopped. They shut it down and nobody knew what to think. Still, though the lack of answers was confusing, residents were pretty happy to hear the news. Dandy's loss was hilarious and wonderful to a large group of people who didn't want this in the first place. Personally, I hadn't given the place a second thought after hearing it had closed over a decade ago. I live about 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so I only managed to hear the rumors and rumblings. No first-hand information made it my way. Then, I found an article from a blogger who had explored the Pirates Atoll resort. He posted detailed descriptions of the crazy shit he discovered there. Everything left behind was smashed, defaced, probably ruined by disgruntled former employees. Hell, maybe people came from miles around to wreck the place. They were probably just as angry about Pirates Atoll as folks here were about the palace. There were even rumors that Dandy Company had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed down. This would have included a variety of dangerous, invasive species, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at them after that? The blog post about Pirates Atoll got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since it closed, I figured it might be interesting to do some urban exploration at Primevair's palace. I could take some photos, write about my experience, and pretty much copy what this other blogger had done long before me. I might even be able to take something home as a memento. I can't say that I hurried there. It took me around a year after I first found that blog post. Over that time, I researched the resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Dandy-related website or resource made any mention of the location. They had all been scrubbed clean. Stranger still, it seemed like no one other than myself had thought to talk about the place, or even post vacation photos from there. None of the local news sites contained one word about the place, though that could be expected since they had all swung Dandy's way. They wouldn't be allowed bring attention to the embarrassment. More recently, I learned that large corporations can actually ask search engines to remove search results. From what I've heard, they don't even need to provide a good reason for the removal. Looking back on it, that's probably what happened. It's not that there were no posts about the resort, but that their words were simply made inaccessible. So, naturally, I could barely find the place in the end. All I had to work with was an old-as-hell map I received in the mail back in the 90s. It was part of a promotional brochure that had been sent out to people who had recently been to Dandyland. My family had visited the park in the late 80s, so we were on the list. I hadn't intended to keep the brochure, but it got shoved into a box with my childhood comic books. I only remembered it existed a few months into my research, and then it took me a couple weeks to get around to visiting my parents and finding where it had all been stored. After I found the map, I was sure the difficult part was over. However, on my way to the resort, I found that the locals weren't going to be any help. Most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years. Others were old residents who sneered the second I spoke the word Primevair, or worse yet, Dandy. The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Exotic plants had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixing with the native species that were desperately vying to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I finally reached the entrance to the main resort. The tremendous monolithic wooden gates still stood, their supports cut from what seemed like giant sequoias. The otherwise majestic gate was gouged by woodpeckers, and the base was slowly being eaten away by burrowing insects. Hanging at face level was a sheet of metal. It was some random scrap, with a hand-painted message scrawled in black paint. Abandoned by Dandy. Clearly, this was the handiwork of some past local or employee who wanted to voice their own small protest. The entrance was open wide enough to slip through, but not wide enough for a vehicle. So grabbing my digital camera, a flashlight, and the brochure, I set off on foot. Flipping the paper over displayed a layout of the resort itself, though the landscape was a little less friendly. The inner grounds were just as wild as the entryway. Fruit trees stood untended and ragged among piles of their own stinking, bug-riddled rot. There was a strange clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers fought for space with tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any smaller outdoor structures were piles of broken charred debris. Something that seemed to be an information booth was now a chopped-up heap of wood and splintered information boards. What vandals hadn't ruined was ruined by inclement weather. What struck me as bizarre was a large statue of Princess Primevair, which stood prominently within a courtyard in front of the palace. She was frozen in a delicate wave toward no one, staring into empty space with a demure, slight smile as generations of bird shit covered her crown, hair, and dress. Ugly, thorny vines entangled her platform. I approached the building. Any colors left were washed out, sun-faded, and much of the plaster meant to simulate stonework had cracked from exposure. Where the paint hadn't peeled or chipped away, there was copious amounts of graffiti. The front doors weren't just left open. They had been taken completely off of their hinges and were seemingly stolen. Above the gaping maw where the front doors had been, someone had once again painted the phrase, "Abandoned by Dandy." You're probably waiting to hear about all the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten valuables, derelict cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless cannibals. But no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I think people may have even stolen the molding off of the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, like counters, desks, and giant fake trees, rested in an empty echo chamber. Every step I took was amplified like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to the specific locations that seemed interesting. The kitchen was as you'd imagine. It was an industrial food prep area with rows of various appliances. No expenses were spared. Every glass surface was broken. Every door was knocked out of its frame. Every metal surface was kicked and dented. Worst of all, the entire room smelled like stale, acrid piss. The walk-in freezer, not even remotely cool at that point, had row upon row of empty shelves. Hooks hung from the ceiling, most likely for hanging cuts of meat. As I took in the sight for a moment, I noticed that several of them were swinging. Their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see if you weren't paying attention. I briefly considered that it had been caused by me moving through, but they were moving in areas I hadn't even been to yet. The public bathrooms were in much the same state. Just like the Pirates Atoll Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with whatever was available to throw. About a half-inch of stinking, stagnant water had pooled on the floor, so of course I didn't stay for long. What's odd is that the toilets and sinks, and the bidets, yes, I went in there, all dripped, leaked, or just flowed freely. It seemed to me that the water should have been shut off quite a long time ago. There were plenty of hotel-style rooms in the resort, but I definitely didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly destroyed, and I wouldn't have realistically found anything interesting in them. I thought I could hear a television or radio in one room, since it almost sounded like there was a conversation going on inside. It was like a whisper, but looking back, it could have just been my own breathing echoing in the silence. Maybe it was just entirely a trick of the mind. It sounded like an exchange between two voices. 1. I didn't believe in it. 2. Nearly inaudible reply. 1. I didn't know that. I couldn't know that. 2. Father told you. 1. Nearly inaudible reply, similar to weeping. I'm aware of how ridiculous that sounds. Still, I suspected there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some meth heads who had holed up there and probably would have knifed me. When I returned to the front of the palace, I figured I hadn't found anything of note. The trip had been a waste of time. I was going to drive straight home again, rather than booking a hotel room, so I couldn't even consider it a one-night vacation. As I looked outside, I noticed something in the courtyard that I must have missed before. It was something that would give me one really cool thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a picture. A lifelike statue of a python, maybe 50 feet long, sat coiled up and sunning itself on a large, graffiti-covered rock. It was almost time for the sun to set, so light was falling onto it in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved in closer to get the details of its face. Slowly, casually, the snake lifted its head and looked directly into my eyes. It turned, slithered off of the rock, across the grass, and into the tree line. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Dandy Company had released all of their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. Of course, I should have expected it. I had read about the sharks at Pirates Atoll, and I should have known they would do this. I was dumbfounded, utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came to my senses and snapped it shut. I blinked stupidly for a moment, then back toward the palace, away from the snake. Even though it was gone, I wasn't taking any chances and retreated to the building to gather my wits again. I looked for a place to sit down and breathe. I had always had an unreasonable fear of snakes, of anything with scales, really. At that point, my legs felt like they'd become jelly. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in broken glass and a leaf carpet crawling with insects. I could have hauled myself onto a desk, but it probably would have collapsed from age. I had seen a receding staircase in the lobby and decided to have a seat there until my pulse stopped pounding in my ears. The stairs were far enough from the front of the building to be somewhat clean, other than a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off of the wall and used it as an improvised seat cover. Once again, it had been painted with the "abandoned by dandy" motto I had become accustomed to. The stairway led down to a below-ground level of the building. Using my flashlight, I could see that the stairs ended at a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign unlike the hastily scrawled ones, read, "Mascots only, thank you." That perked up my spirits for two reasons. First, a mascots-only area would definitely contain some interesting things back in the day. Second, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, the looters, no one. That was the one place I could actually explore, and perhaps find really unique stuff to photograph or even steal. I had come to the palace with the decision that it was okay to take something back for proof. After all, the owners clearly didn't care. I didn't have much hope of breaking the lock. The ravages of age weren't powerful enough to corrode the metal that much. What I could do, however, was separate the plate that held it in place from the damaged wood of the wall. The screws pulled free easily once I applied enough pressure. Either others hadn't thought to try bypassing the lock, or it was still too solid when they had tried. The mascots-only area was a startling and welcomed change from the rest of the palace. Every second or third fluorescent light was illuminated, though they flickered and faded randomly. Nothing had been broken or stolen, though time and desertion had taken their toll. Tables bore notepads and pens. Clocks hung on the walls, frozen at different times. There was a punch-in clock, complete with filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and long rotted-out food and drinks sat on countertops. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything is left in a state of evacuation. As I wandered the maze-like sub-basement hallways, the sights became more and more disquieting. Further in, desks and tables were knocked over. Scattered papers had melded with the damp floor, and a large expanse of fungus was slowly overtaking rotted carpeting. Everything was just squishy. Anything made of wood disintegrated into mush when I applied even the least amount of force. Clothing items left hanging on hooks simply fell to moist threads if I tried to remove them. One thing that got on my nerves was that the light became more sparse and unreliable as I proceeded. It wasn't dark enough for a flashlight, but not bright enough to be comfortable. The depths of the sub-basement grew dank and suffocating. Eventually, I reached a bright yellow door with the words, "Mascot Prep 1, stenciled on its surface. In my excitement, I all but yanked off the doorknob. I figured that room held the costumes, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I acknowledged defeat and began to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound, after which the door slowly creaked open just a bit. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used my light to search for a switch on the wall by the door, but there was none. As I focused on the walls, I was jarred out of my concentration by a sudden and piercing electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading like the others I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed as if the light was going to keep growing in brightness until the bulbs exploded. Just when I thought it would reach that critical stage, they dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly how I had imagined it. Various dandy character costumes hung on the walls like strange cartoon cadavers, suspended from invisible nooses. What I found odd, and what I really needed to make a record of, was a Lucky Lemming costume at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back like a murder victim. Its fur was matted and shedding, creating bare patches. What's worse, however, was the coloring of the costume. I think mold and mildew must have taken root, seeming to turn it into a photo-negative version of the actual Lucky Lemming. Black rot where he should have been white, white fungus filaments where he should have been black. His clothes seemed faded and bleached, the opposite of their usual hue. The sight was so off-putting that I postponed looking at the thing again until I was ready to leave the room. I took a picture of the costumes hung on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrefied cartoon faces. The occasional missing eye made it all the more grim. Then, I decided to stage a shot. I was going to place one of the bedraggled character heads on the slick, grimy floor. Reaching for the headpiece of a loopy loon costume, I carefully removed it so it wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud, clattering sound made me jump with fright. Looking down at my feet, I saw a human skull now resting between my shoes. It had fallen out of the mascot head and cracked into several pieces. The empty face stared up at me, jaw detached. I dropped the costume head immediately, as you'd no doubt expect. I moved for the door, but something stopped me. I looked back to the skull and felt a flush of anger. I had to take a picture to show the world. I'd need proof of this, especially if the Dandy Corporation was going to somehow make this all disappear. I had no doubt in my mind that Dandy was responsible for this, even if it was just gross negligence. Whatever happened, this was the real reason the resort had closed. I was the only one who knew. Me. As I contemplated the implications, that's when Lucky, that photo-negative opposite character in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting, then climbing to its feet, the Lucky Lemming costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood on oversized, unsteady feet. All I could do was mumble, "No," over and over again as its false face stared me down with an inoffensive, pleasant expression. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera. It took all of my strength to raise and aim it at the thing that was quietly sizing me up, head tilted. The camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Lucky Lemming costume. As the camera shifted and shook in my hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Lucky's outline appeared. The camera died. It went blank and quiet. It was broken. I raised my eyes once again from the black screen to the costume in front of me. "Hey," it said in a hushed, perfectly executed Lucky Lemming voice. "Want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working clumsy glove-clad fingers around the surface of its neck with clawing, impatient movements. It was like watching a wounded man trying to pull himself free from a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits into the fabric flesh, rolling rivulets of thick, curdled yellow bile spilled from what seemed like wounds. At least, it looked like bile. Infected blood? Pus? Vomit? I had zero interest in finding out. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh. I only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of the room, I saw a final message clawed into metal with fingernails, or possibly bone. Abandoned by God. The picture files in the camera were irretrievable. I never got my head around writing the blog entry about what happened. After I ran from that place, fleeing for my sanity as much as my life, I knew why the Dandy Corporation didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in, because they didn't want anything like that getting out. A little girl sat in her room. Her messy brown hair was put into little pigtails as her hazel eyes stared at the door. She hugged her stuffed giraffe close to her little body and listened closely to the loud yells of her father and mother. "I never should have had any damned kids," screamed a loud, deep voice. "All they do is make messes, complain, and draw on the walls." He was interrupted by the shrill, angry yell of the girl's mother. "They're children, David. They don't know any better." "Oh, fuck me, Mary Beth. I don't want to hear your bullshit excuses. I've had just about enough of them." "And what do you plan to do about it?" The girl heard loud footsteps coming towards her room, and she hugged her giraffe closer. The door opened violently, and in the doorway stood her large, infuriated, overweight father. In one of his meaty hands, he held a large textbook. "David, stop it!" screamed her mother. But the father ignored his wife's pleading cries. He grabbed the little girl harshly by the collar, and she screamed and kicked, trembling in fear. The girl's father held up the textbook. "This is for drawing on my fucking walls, you little bitch." Years later, the little girl, known as Natalie, was now 9 years old. Going through the stage of puberty, she was naturally a little chubby. Like the usual, she sat in her room, watching TV. Her dad was ranting on about some economic crap that she really could give less a shit about, as she munched on some popcorn. She was also currently drawing a picture. There was a bit of gore in it, but strangely, she really liked drawing blood. It gave her some weird satisfaction. Other than that, multitasking was no problem for her. It became apparent to her at a young age, after having to do so much hard work and labor, that she was able to do so many things at once. Drawing ended up being her talent and passion. It was her way from escaping from reality, whenever something bad would rear its ugly head and peer in, or when she was simply bored. She suddenly heard the closing of her door, and looked to the left, pausing on munching on her popcorn. There stood her brother Lucas, who was 14 years old. "What is it?" She could still hear her father's yelling from outside her door. "Dad scaring you?" He let out a chuckle. "No way. I think we're both used to his yelling by now." There was a long pause. "So, why are you in here?" He played with his sleeves slightly and twitched a bit. "I have to ask you something." He trained his eyes on her. She frowned slightly, growing impatient with her brother interrupting her movie and drawing. "What?" He moved a little closer. "You said you wanted to be cool and grown up, like a teenager, right?" She nodded and suddenly brightened up slightly. "Well, I have an offer. Just spit it out, you dimwit. You know what guys and girls do together sometimes, right?" The next day at school, Natalie did not say a word. She did not speak for the whole day. She didn't have anyone to speak to anyways. Nobody could know. Nobody should know. And so nobody would know. Her teacher picked up on a few of her puzzled expressions, but she dismissed it as if she just did not understand the lesson. Natalie also felt as if she was in severe pain. She had no idea it could hurt. Feeling scared, she walked home and silently went to her room. But later in the day, she was once again greeted by her brother. Nobody would know. At school, she finally decided to tell someone. Even though they weren't her friends, she just felt she had to. She walked up to the group of girls she would occasionally see in the hallway. They looked like nice girls, and they and Natalie had occasionally talked before. "Hey, Mia." The ginger girl looked over at Natalie with a straight face. "Yeah?" Mia said to Natalie. I really need to talk to you about something. It's been going on for a while, and you and your friends, well, I feel like you're the only people I can trust." Mia and her friends seemed to pull little smirks, but only for a moment. Little did Natalie know that they were hungry for gossip. "All right, you can trust us. What's up?" One day later was all it took. She had been getting constant remarks on social networking sites, such as Facebook. One time, someone even called her a whore. Not to mention their lunch had ended up getting in her hair. It was going to be the least of her problems, but Natalie, being only 9, could not help but be greatly upset at this fact. However, she did not cut, she did not peep, and she never said a word about it. As you may recall, so far in this journey, she had kept everything inside. She supposed it was better. She wouldn't let any pain get the best of her. 3 a.m. School night. Her mother was going to kill her. The girl known as Natalie was now 16. She was productive in high school, close to the honor roll. For once, she felt calm and happy. Though, like the usual, she would occasionally become a hermit in her room, hiding away from her dad, who still liked to constantly yell and scream about the economy, money and politics, and all of the other bullshit that she was flat out tired of hearing. Her eyes started to feel heavy. She had an assignment to work on, but that was no longer important to her. All that was on her mind was sleep. She closed her laptop, and after her eyes adjusted to the darkness slightly, she saw her old, worn-down stuffed giraffe in the corner. She stared at it, in complete and utter silence. Memories passed through her mind, and she felt tears come to her eyes. But quickly, she blinked them back. No more breaking, she thought to herself, but she continued to stare at it. "What the fuck are you looking at?" she said to the stuffed object. It simply stared back with soft, black, beady eyes. She shook her head and stood up. She looked down sadly at the little toy animal and gently picked it up in her arms. She cradled it and spoke softly to it. I'm sorry." Some tears ran down her face. She pet its rough, short fur softly as she lay down on her bed. She slowly went to sleep. She was woken up by the angry growls of her mother. Exhausted, she slowly opened one of her eyes. "I can't believe I forgot to take that laptop away. You were on it all night, weren't you?" Natalie sighed and pressed her face deeper into the pillow, hugging her giraffe closer. Her mother sighed and walked out. She took a shower, brushed her teeth, and ate some breakfast. Then she got dressed. She put on a gray and blue hoodie with fur inside its hood. It wasn't her favorite, but it was the only one she could wear to school due to the others being in the wash. She also put on black jeans and some thin, fashionable boots. Finally, she went down the stairs to get driven to school. She hopped in the car and her mom sped off. However, on the way there, due to lack of sleep, she slowly put her head against the window of the car and began to drift off. Her dreams, or more accurately nightmares, consisted firstly of her physical abuse as a child, and secondly, of the sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her own brother Lucas. The abuse had lasted for 4 years before she had the guts to turn him away. She started twitching and cringing in her sleep, but her mother took no notice. Her mother never took notice. Suddenly, she was jolted awake by the sound of her mother's voice. "We're here," her mother said with annoyance in her voice, most likely from catching Natalie napping again. She looked at the large sign of the school, which read, Walkerville Collegiate Institute for the Creative Fine Arts. She sighed tiredly and stepped out, putting her backpack on her shoulder. "See ya," she proclaimed and closed the car door. She walked into the school and chatted with a couple of friends until she went up to her locker on the 3rd floor. She grabbed her books, and before the 5 minutes of time was over, she ran to class. Her English teacher annoyingly put her hand on Natalie's desk. "Where's your assignment, Miss Ouellette?" Natalie swallowed. I forgot it at home. Sorry, Miss Homenuik." "Your time is up, Miss Ouellette. Don't disappoint me." Natalie seemed puzzled by the thought for a moment. She didn't know why, but those words seemed to melt through her. She simply ignored it and went back to listening to the lesson and falling asleep not too long after, of course. Later that day, she was heading to her locker for 4th period when suddenly her boyfriend Chris approached her. "Hey, talk to me after school, all right?" She smiled. She loved talking to Chris. At the time, she didn't suspect anything. Chris was always sweet to her. During her French class, Natalie failed to pay attention. Instead, she doodled the things she loved to draw the most: blood, gore, people being stabbed, knives, and macabre things of the sort. Others would say it was pretty dark of her to draw such things, but she saw nothing wrong with it. For some strange reason, it actually felt like a normal thing to her. "Miss Ouellette?" She quickly covered the doodles on her paper and looked up at her French teacher quickly, trying to hide her fear. Yes, Mr. Levasseur." With a slight turn of his head, he gestured for her to move her arm. "Show me your work." She hesitantly moved her arm, showing her teacher the picture of someone getting stabbed by an insane man. The teacher stared, puzzled, looking at her a bit. She smiled nervously. "Erase that and get started on your work," he said in a strangely calm voice. He walked away and she sighed and began to erase the picture. "And Miss Ouellette," Mr. Levasseur interrupted. She looked up at him slightly. "Your time is almost up to get your work done. I suggest doing it now." She growled at the remark. Time always seemed to be against her. As far as she was concerned, time could go fuck itself. After class, she walked out of the school to find her boyfriend standing near the fence on the sidewalk. She smiled and walked over, hoping he had something to say that would cheer her up on this miserable day. But as she walked closer, her smile slowly faded. He wasn't smiling back. "Chris, what's wrong? What did you want to talk to me about?" He sighed. "Natalie, I think it's time that we should start seeing other people." She felt her heart break. "But why?" Natalie cried. He responded with a stern look. "It's your mindset, your drawings. They just creep me out. I think there's really something wrong with you, and the saddest part is that you haven't told me why you're acting like this. It makes me feel irresponsible. So I just can't do it anymore. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked away. Natalie slammed her hands on the bathroom counter at home. She stared at herself in the mirror, her eye twitching. I won't hurt myself like the others. I can stay strong." There was a needle and black thread in her hand. It's pointless. It doesn't help. Some weird sensation pulled at her subconscious. She chuckled slightly. "No, I'm doing it because I want to." She held up the needle with thread on the end of it and smirked. Time is up. Piece after piece, cut after cut. Even though excruciating pain was going through her, she did not whine. She did not whimper. She did not cry. There were no more tears to shed. All she did was smile. Blood leaked from the pierces and made a low dripping noise into the sink and onto the counter. When she was finished, she stood back and admired her handiwork. She stroked the horrendous stitches on the sides of her mouth, which spread into a wide smile. She felt the warm, wet blood on her fingers and licked it gently, consuming the metallic-tasting liquid in pure ecstasy. She stopped when she saw her mother's reflection in the mirror behind her and sharply turned around. She saw her mother's wide eyes and pale face, and she looked at her fingers, seeing the blood. She suddenly felt the pain and began to cry. "Mom?" Natalie cried. She had never felt so confused. What had just happened to her? Her mother had scheduled some therapy for her. Natalie had not gotten rid of the stitches, in fear of how much pain it would bring, so she went to the session with them. She made sure her hood was up, as to not let anyone see. She sat down on the comfortable leather seat and stared at the blonde woman across from her in silence. "So your name's Natalie, isn't it?" Natalie nodded. "I'm Deborah, and I'm here to help. Now tell me, Natalie, what have been some of your problems recently?" Natalie stared. Time has been my problem." Deborah gave her a confused look. "What about time, dear?" Natalie's hands roughly gripped the leather of the seat. "Everything. It makes you live through it, slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society, only to be tortured to seemingly no end, until you find you no longer have a purpose. It's a vicious circle. Time does not end. It does not slow down. It does not speed up. It is violent. It makes you live through the torture over and over again, unable to fast forward through any of it." Natalie really had no idea what she had just said. She felt like she wasn't herself anymore. Could this be because of all the things she had kept contained? No, that was impossible. But for some strange reason, she liked it. The therapist leaned in closer. "Sweetheart, I want you to tell me what's happened to you." Natalie continued staring. There was a long pause. She smirked slightly, the wounds from her stitches opening slightly once again. "Why don't you tell me, Blondie? You're the expert." Deborah appeared mildly annoyed. "Natalie, I can't help unless you tell me what's wrong." Natalie's fingers started to tear into the leather seating. "Natalie isn't here anymore." With that, Deborah's eyes widened and she rose to her feet. "I'll be right back. Please stay here." She walked out, leaving Natalie alone. Maybe if she had done something at this point, she wouldn't have come to be what she is today. Maybe more people would be alive. And maybe she would be sane like she had been before. As much as I would love to say that Natalie got up from that chair and stopped what came next from happening, I'm obligated to give you the horrid truth. Natalie did not move. She sat perfectly still, in total silence, and absolutely calm, in that chair. And after a while of waiting impatiently, her parents walked in. Natalie stood, happy to go, but she noticed her parents' expressions. Even her father had a strange, saddened expression on his face. Her confusion grew, but she said nothing and followed them to the car. On the way, while she thought she was going back home, she started to drift off. Strangely, she heard a dark voice speak in her dream. It almost sounded like her own, echoing into an eternal abyss. "Your time is up." She shot awake, some beads of sweat rolling down her face. She wasn't home. She wasn't in the car. She was in a bed, a white bed, in a white room. She looked to her side and realized she was hooked up to a heart monitor. She attempted to get up, but that's when she realized that she was restrained. She panicked. She began to struggle, but paused when she heard a door open to her left. A man in a white shirt looked at her, his hands behind his back. He resembled one of the cliched doctors you would see in a television program set in a scientific lab. She paid full attention as Mr. Scientist started to speak. "Advertisements. I can only imagine how very confused you must be right now," he said, "but I'm letting you know we're only here to help. Your parents agreed to allow us to administer medication to you, in hopes of helping your state of mind." Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but was quickly silenced. "You don't need to worry," the doctor sought to reassure her. "You'll be back to normal in no time. Just try to relax." He walked over, and as he did, she tried to skittishly move away, but was unable to due to the leather straps binding her wrists and legs. He carefully took a mask and put it over her mouth and nose. She stubbornly tried to get it off, but felt herself starting to slip under as the drugs kicked in, and slowly her eyes shut. Suddenly, Natalie woke up. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. She was being given multiple injections, and something was being rubbed on her skin. She felt woozy, but was otherwise completely aware of her surroundings. She was entering a rare state patients sometimes find themselves in while undergoing surgery, in which they are able to see as they are being worked on. In this state, they can feel the pain, and their brain is active, but they are unable to respond. Natalie, however, was able to. Her heart rate began to accelerate, as reflected on the nearby monitor, and the doctors took notice of this. They looked at her and took notice of her opened eyes. One of the doctors yelled at another. Natalie couldn't make out what they were saying, but she suddenly felt a rush of adrenaline. Shaking violently, she slowly started to slip out of her bonds. One of the doctors moved to hold her down, but then hesitated to do so. Natalie watched as all three of the doctors backed away in unison. She sat on the edge of the bed and the IV tubes from her arm and the mask from her face. She got to her feet and started to stumble towards them. Her breath hitched and her vision was blurry. She was vaguely aware by then that she was chuckling like a madman. But suddenly, she felt a searing pain in her chest. She gripped her chest in agony and dropped to her knees. She coughed up blood, fell prostrate to the floor, and blacked out. Natalie woke up slowly and groggily sometime later. She found herself back in bed and a doctor sitting beside it. "I'm so sorry, Natalie. Something went horribly wrong." Natalie didn't know why, but she felt a tremendous amount of hatred towards the doctor. He took notice of her disgust and looked away instinctively. "You weren't supposed to wake up while we were giving you the doses for your mental state," the doctor continued. "We aren't sure how it affected you, but we have a feeling we're going to find out." He paused for a moment before taking out a small mirror. The entire time he looked away from her. "Regrettably, the medication impacted your appearance as well." Natalie looked at herself in the mirror and her eyes widened. Her eyes were completely green. She noticed she still had the stitches in her mouth as well. But for some reason she couldn't help but feel overjoyed. Her heart rate began to rise again. She gave a low chuckle. The doctor looked on in shock as Natalie quickly moved toward him until she close enough for him to feel her breath. "Doctor," she began, still chuckling. He trembled slightly and pressed a button on the underside of the monitor. "Yes," he stammered in reply. "Your time is up." A loud scream was heard through the halls of the facility. 2 security guards rushed into the room, kicking open the door. Blood. Blood was the first thing they saw. Blood on the walls, on the bed, on the floor, even on the ceiling. Natalie had strapped the doctor to her bed. The bed was bent at a sharp angle, and the doctor's spine was completely snapped. Blood poured from his eyes, nose, and mouth, and there in the corner was the murderer, happily drawing her gruesome pictures on the wall in blood, alongside the hastily scrawled phrase, "Your time is up." Natalie slowly turned to look at the guards, and a wide, crazy grin spread across her face. "Hello, friends. Would you like to play?" And with that, Natalie began laughing uncontrollably. The guards quickly drew their guns, but before they could act, Natalie charged at one of them. One of the guards fired a round, but Natalie was able to dodge it. She grabbed a large knife from a sheath on his pocket and slashed it right across his waistline. Blood and organs flooded out, and he collapsed to the ground. She inhaled deeply, loving the damp stench of death. The remaining guard shook with fear and dropped his gun. She slowly walked up to him and placed the tip of the knife against his chest. "Your time is up." She slowly slid the knife down his chest, all the way to the end of his abdomen. His organs spilled out onto the floor, and he collapsed, dead. Natalie's mother had been sleeping soundly in her room beside her husband. She awoke to the sound of knocking on her door. She groggily got up and walked out of the bedroom and to the front door. It was pouring outside, and thunder boomed in the distance. She approached the door but paused before grabbing the knob. She detected a faint sound of insane laughter. The rain and thunder seemed to quiet down suddenly. She pressed her ear against the door and listened closely. "Hello, Mother," a voice from the other side called out. Natalie burst through the door, wielding 2 knives. Her mother stumbled back, hitting her head against a nearby coat rack. One of the hooks penetrated her skull and she bled considerably from the resulting wound. She fell to the ground paralyzed but still conscious, lying in a pool of her own blood. Natalie towered over her, and then knelt slowly to meet her mother at eye level, and displayed her blood-soaked blades proudly. "I was suffering, Mother," Natalie cooed. She ran the tip of the knife across her mother's cheek, cutting it slightly. Natalie tilted her head. "But you did nothing." All her mother could do was shake and gasp, like a fish out of water. Natalie grabbed her mother and gently laid her flat on the ground. From there, she straddled her and began cutting a V into her chest. Her mother could only gasp and shake as the life drained from her. She choked and gurgled, and her breaths became labored. Natalie knew she didn't have much time left. She proceeded to forcibly open her mother's chest cavity with a loud crack, reached in, and grabbed her mother's still beating heart with her bare hand. Its pulses were growing farther and farther apart. Suddenly she ripped it out, blood spraying all over her face. She stared her mother directly in the face as she took her final breaths. "Sweet dreams," she said to her mother's corpse. "Your time was up." She put the heart into her mother's mouth, patted her cheek softly, and stood up. She wasn't done yet. Natalie's father, David, had stirred awake and had realized that his wife had not returned to bed yet. His eyes had only just adjusted to the darkness when he suddenly noticed Natalie standing at his bedside with a crazed smirk plastered on her face and her newly green-tinted eyes glowing in the darkness. She was covered in blood, and the scent was unbearable. She frowned dramatically. "Oh dear, Mother's gone. I wonder who will get the money," Natalie jeered. She swiftly grabbed her father's forehead, laughing maniacally. "That's all you ever cared about anyway." Her father, unlike her mother, was a fighter, and he sprung up and grabbed Natalie by the neck and threw her to the ground. He started to stomp on her chest until she coughed up blood, and he stared down at her. Doesn't it feel good, Daddy?" She laughed in spite of the violence and coughed up more blood. After all, you never seemed to mind doing it all those years ago, did you?" He narrowed his eyes. "You aren't my daughter." A wider smirk spread across her face, and she peered at him with her luminous eyes, blood dripping down her mouth. "You're right. I'm not." She suddenly tripped him, causing him to fall hard to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, knives in hand. They say the bigger you are, the harder they fall. While he was winded, she grabbed a pillow and stuffed it into his face, and then stomped on it, harder and harder, until loud cracking noises could be heard. When she finally pulled the pillow away, her father's face was gruesomely mutilated, and he was making muffled noises and crying in agony. "What's the matter, Daddy? Pain too much for you?" She shoved both knives into his stomach and left them there, then moved to rip one of the large, heavy wooden poles from the bed. She set it down on her father's legs and withdrew the knives. "Gonna need these," she chuckled, and sat down upon the pole laid on his legs. Suddenly, she started to rock back while sitting down. The weight from her body on the pole slowly started to squeeze his innards up through his body. He started to gag and blood poured from his mouth. His breath was silenced, and she hit a bit of a snag. Come on," she snarled as she forced herself to rock back with more weight. Suddenly, his organs burst out of his mouth. The nasty gore piled onto the floor on the sides of his face. She nodded to his carcass and started to walk out. "Your time was up, Daddy." Finally, this would be her favorite part. She quietly snuck down to her brother's room, silently opening the door. Blood dripped from her knife, making a low tapping sound as the droplets hit the hard wood. Her brother wasn't in bed. It was apparent that he must be hiding somewhere. She grinned. "Oh dear brother, come now." She started to walk inside. "All I want to do is to have a little fun. Ha 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 ha." As she stepped in more, she listened closely for any sounds, any breathing, any moving. She even sniffed the air for his putrid scent. And the closer she listened, she finally noticed something. A faint breathing noise. Whack! She fell to the ground, trembling. Her brother was behind her with a now bloodied baseball bat. He was glaring down with anger, panting in rage. She tried to slowly get up, but he hit her again, and again, and again. "Mother always did like you best, you bitch!" He hit her hard one last time before taking a breather. She was bleeding heavily, her green eyes drooped and glowing faintly in the darkness. She felt weak and looked closer up at the ceiling. She recalled the days she had spent in here, being tortured, having to go through it for 4 years, looking at that same damned ceiling. It sent a sudden rush of energy into her body, and she started to stand, laughing insanely. Ha 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 ha. Her brother went to hit her again, but used both of her knives to block it. "You're going to hell, brother." With a large push, she sent her brother flying on the bed. He hit his head against the wall and growled angrily, about to lunge at her, when she stabbed the 2 knives into his arms, keeping them pinned on the wall. He screamed and struggled rapidly. "Let's see what we can use here." She started walking around the room and smirked, seeing a simple butter knife on his bedside. She picked it up and walked over to him. "They say that the eyes are the softest organs on the body." She slowly licked the knife. Soft as butter. He looked in horror, trying to get away, as she started to dig out his eyes with the knife. He shrieked loudly, and she quickly tied a cloth around his mouth. Now, we can't have you waking the neighbors." He wasn't able to see anything. The pain was unbearable. Blood leaked violently from his eye sockets. He would cry, but was now incapable. She dug around for more items and picked up a pair of scissors. She walked over to him, crawling over him. "I think you need to cut loose Brother Tilda." She stabbed the scissors into his gut, and he cried out in a muffled scream of pain. She treated him like arts and crafts, cutting through his skin like paper. She lifted up his large intestine and smirked wickedly. "You know what I love? Macaroni art." She started to cut the intestine into sections. These might be a little too big to put on a plate, though. She could hear his brother foaming blood from the mouth. However, he had to swallow the blood back because of the cloth around his mouth. "Doesn't that taste good?" She licked his blood off her fingers. "I sure know I like it." He let out another muffled scream. She went down to his toes and started cracking them and ripping them off, one by one. After a while, his screams grew futile. His throat was raw and bloody by now. Next, she worked on his fingers, snapping them and ripping them off slowly. The gurgling became louder, and he started to squirm. He was choking on his own blood. She pulled the cloth down and blood poured from his mouth, and turned his head to the side and vomited violently. There, brother," she said, patting his head. "Eat this and feel better." She stuffed one of his fingers in his mouth, making it jam into his throat. He choked and slowly died. Your time was up. The girl, known as Natalie, walking into her room dripping blood. Off to the corner she saw it, her stuffed giraffe. She knelt down and stared at it. Then, without a word, she stood back up and walked to the bathroom. Staring at herself, covered in blood, she heard a faint ticking noise. She looked down and saw a pocket watch. She stared at its hands slowly turning, listening to the ticking for what seemed like an eternity. She took out one of her now red knives as it heavily dripped blood onto the counter. She grabbed the pocket watch and disassembled the watch until only the small clock was left. "Time makes you live through the torture," she said, slowly bringing the knife up to her eye. Slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society. She started to slowly dig it into her eye, as the vision in her left eye grew blurry and red, until you find you no longer have a purpose. She felt her eye start to come free from its socket, blood pouring in the sink. It's a vicious circle. She felt it dangle out of her socket, a sharp pain where it was connecting in her head. Time does not speed up. It does not slow down. It is violent. She grabbed onto the cord of her eye and tore it right off, the eye falling in the sink. It makes you live through the torture over and over again. She started to place the clock in her eye, unable to fast forward away from it. There was a squishing sound and drips of blood, until it seemed like the clock fit perfectly in her socket. I am clockwork. The young 16-year-old girl, formerly known as Natalie, walked away from her burning house. The flames engulfed everything, and inside, the giraffe slowly burned, along with the carcasses of her family. Some say she still lives on, carrying her insanity with her. Leaving so many dead, saying she decided when their time should come to an end. The only way to detect her presence is if you're cuddled close in the covers at night, sleeping soundly. But in the darkness, she watches, she determines. You hear ticking, and you see a green flash of that putrid clock eye. If she is there, you know your time is up. I remember the day the world changed. It was a Tuesday, mundane in every aspect until the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with the silhouettes of colossal beings, titans they were soon called. I watched from my living room window, the coffee in my hand forgotten, as chaos erupted in the streets. Cars screeched to halts, people ran screaming, and all the while those titans stood motionless, as if surveying their new domain. The news was frantic, a cacophony of theories, warnings, and escalating panic. Then, as suddenly as it had erupted, silence fell. The broadcast stopped, the internet flickered out, and the world outside my door became a silent, ominous void. In those first hours, I was paralyzed by fear and disbelief. How could such creatures exist? Were they the harbingers of our end? The questions spun in my mind, unanswered. As night fell, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, isolated in my own home, a fragile sanctuary in a world that had suddenly become alien and threatening. The following days blurred into a routine dictated by survival. I rationed my food, water, and power, knowing that my supplies were finite and the outside world was now a place of unknown dangers. I covered the windows, barricaded the doors, and moved in silence, as if the titans could hear me, could see me cowering in my own home. Venturing outside became a necessity dictated by dwindling supplies. I waited for the cover of night, moving stealthily through the shadows of the titans. Their presence was overwhelming, a constant reminder of our new reality. They seemed indifferent to me, to us, as if we were ants scurrying beneath their notice. Yet, the fear of drawing their attention kept me cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of their impossibly large footsteps. The world outside was a ghost town, cars abandoned mid-escape, doors ajar, signs of life interrupted. I looted what I could from nearby stores, the eerie silence punctuated by the distant sounds of collapse and destruction, a haunting soundtrack to my scavenging. One evening, as I navigated back to my sanctuary, I found a radio, its batteries nearly dead. I brought it back, a sliver of hope in my pocket. To my astonishment, it crackled to life, a voice breaking through the static, speaking of a safe haven for survivors. The message was looped, the details scant, but it was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of solitude pressing down on me. The radio's message played over in my mind. Was it a call to salvation, or a siren's song leading to further despair? The uncertainty was a gnawing ache, but the hope it offered was a potent drug. The Titans, for all their imposing silence, had become a constant in my life, a danger I had learned to navigate. But the human element, the unknown intentions of those broadcasting the message, that was a variable I was unsure how to calculate. Yet as the days passed and my supplies dwindled once more, the choice was made for me. I would set out at dawn, the radio tucked into my bag, its message a mantra in my mind. I was no longer a mere survivor. I was a seeker, a man on a quest not just for safety, but for the remnants of humanity in a world overshadowed by Titans. The world beyond my barricaded door was more alien than I remembered. Buildings, once symbols of human ingenuity and perseverance, now stood as hollowed-out shells, testament to our fragility in the face of the Titans. The air was thick with an unspoken dread, a palpable tension that clung to the ruins of our civilization. Each step I took on the deserted streets was a step into the unknown, a dance with shadows both literal and metaphorical. My first expedition was born of necessity, a desperate quest for sustenance and supplies. The local grocery store, once a place of mundane routine, had transformed into a beacon of hope amidst the desolation. I moved with caution, aware of the omnipresent threat of the Titans. Their sheer size made them easy to avoid in theory, but their unpredictability was a constant danger. I had seen them move, their actions devoid of any discernible pattern or purpose, as if they were guided by whims we could not comprehend. I entered the store, my heart pounding in my chest, not from exertion, but from the fear of what might lurk within. The shelves were largely picked clean, a visual echo of the panic that had swept through the city in the Titans' wake. Yet, I found enough to sustain me, canned goods, bottled water, things that would last. The silence in the store was oppressive, a stark reminder that I was alone in a world that no longer belonged to us. As I made my way back, laden with my meager haul, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I scanned the horizon, expecting at any moment to lock eyes with a Titan, but there was nothing. The journey back was a blur of adrenaline-fueled vigilance. With each step towards the safety of my home, the weight of isolation bore down on me, a relentless reminder of what I had lost, of what we all had lost. The radio broadcast, a thread of hope in the enveloping darkness, became my lifeline. I clung to the promise of a safe haven, a place where survivors could find solace in each other's company, where the shadow of the Titans might be a bit less suffocating. Yet doubts gnawed at me. In a world upended, trust was a luxury, and hope could easily lead to despair. Despite the risks, my forays into the outside world became more frequent. Each expedition was a calculated risk, a balance between the need for supplies and the ever-present danger of the Titans. I became adept at moving unseen, using the rubble and the ruins as cover, always mindful of the giants that loomed just beyond my line of sight. On one such outing, I encountered another survivor. The moment was fleeting, a shared glance of understanding and fear before we retreated into our respective shadows. The encounter was a stark reminder of the human cost of this catastrophe, of the isolation that had become our shared reality. Yet, it also kindled a spark of defiance within me. We were still here, still fighting, still surviving. In the face of the Titans, in the shadow of their indifference, we persisted. This realization, this refusal to succumb to despair, propelled me forward. The safe haven, once a distant dream, now became a goal, a destination that promised more than just survival. It promised a return to something resembling life, a community of souls united by shared loss and a shared desire to reclaim our place in the world. The days melted into each other, each one a mirror of the last, until the moment I decided to venture beyond the familiar ruins of my neighborhood. With the radio's promise of a haven fueling my determination, I found myself drawn into the heart of the city, where the shadows of the Titans loomed larger, and the silence was replaced by the occasional terrifying sound of their movements. I learned to navigate this new world with a mix of awe and horror. The awe was for the sheer scale of the Titans, creatures so vast that buildings crumbled beneath their feet like sandcastles before the tide. The horror was for the destruction they wrought without malice or intent, simply by existing in a world too small to contain them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, I found myself in what had once been a bustling marketplace. Now it was a graveyard of aspirations, dreams laid waste by the Titan's arrival. It was there I encountered another survivor, a woman named Clara, her eyes as hard as flint but not without a spark of life. Clara taught me the true meaning of survival. It wasn't just about scavenging and hiding, it was about fighting for every breath, every heartbeat. She had been tracking the movements of a particular Titan, one that had strayed from the rest, its behavior erratic, unpredictable. She believed it might be injured, a theory that offered a terrifying opportunity. If we could get close enough to study it, we might learn something vital about these beings. Driven by a mix of desperation and the human need to understand our oppressors, we planned our approach under the cover of darkness. The streets we traversed were a labyrinth of destruction, each turn revealing new horrors. Bodies abandoned in their flight, silent screams etched onto their faces. As we neared the Titan, the air grew thick, charged with a palpable tension. The sheer wall of its flesh loomed before us, a monument to our insignificance. Clara signaled for silence, her gaze fixed on the giant before us. It was then that I felt it, a vibration through the soles of my shoes, a whisper of movement that crescendoed into a rumble. The Titan was moving. Panic surged, a primal instinct to flee, but Clara's hand on my arm was grounding. We were witnesses to a moment few had survived, the slow, ponderous movement of a Titan. Its leg rose, a pillar of flesh and sinew blocking out the stars, then descended with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. We should have retreated then, but curiosity, that most human of flaws, held us captive. It was our downfall. The Titan's head turned, its eyes, vast pools of unblinking darkness, fixed on our hiding spot. Time slowed, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, a counterpoint to the Titan's breath, a gust of wind that smelled of earth and blood. Then chaos. Clara pulled me back, her voice a distant echo, as the world erupted. The Titan had spotted us, its interest piqued by the insects daring to observe it. We ran, dodging falling debris, the ground trembling with each step the Titan took. Our escape was a blur of adrenaline and fear. We lost it, or it lost interest. I'm not sure which. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath in the shadow of a collapsed building, the night was silent once more. Clara and I shared a look, a mix of relief and the dawning realization of how close we had come to death. That night, I learned the true horror of our new world. It wasn't just the Titans themselves, but the realization of our own fragility, the ease with which we could be extinguished. Yet in that horror, there was a perverse form of beauty, the resilience to stand in the face of such monstrous indifference and choose to fight, to survive. The experience bonded Clara and me, not just as survivors, but as warriors in a battle for our very existence. We parted ways with a promise to meet again, to continue our dance with the giants, armed with the knowledge that in this new world, horror and beauty were two sides of the same coin. After my harrowing encounter with the Titan, the world seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The ruins of the city whispered tales of despair, and the shadows seemed to stretch towards me, grasping with fingers made of darkness. But within me, a flame of resolve had been kindled by Clara's courage. The path to the safe haven was fraught with danger, yet it was a beacon that called to me through the night. The journey was a testament to the apocalypse that had befallen us. Buildings, once symbols of human achievement, now lay in ruin, their skeletal remains a playground for the shadows. The air was thick with a silence that screamed, punctured only by the distant, mournful wails of the Titans. I moved cautiously, avoiding the open streets where the Titans roamed, their sheer size turning them into unwitting agents of destruction. As I navigated through the city's labyrinth, the thin veneer of civilization I had clung to began to peel away, revealing a primal instinct for survival that I had never known existed within me. Each step forward was a victory against the fear that sought to paralyze me, each breath a defiance of the death that hung over the world like a shroud. It wasn't long before I encountered others, survivors, each a mirror reflecting the same blend of hope and desperation that drove me. We formed a ragtag band, bound by the shared goal of reaching the haven. Among them was Mara, a young woman whose spirit seemed unbroken by the world's collapse. Her determination was infectious, and under her unofficial leadership we pressed on, a flicker of humanity moving through the darkness. Our journey was marked by moments of terror and beauty. We once found ourselves trapped in an abandoned building as a Titan passed, the structure groaning under the pressure of the creature's proximity. We huddled together in silence, barely daring to breathe as the Titan's shadow enveloped us, a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the very concept of hope. Yet when it passed, and the light returned, it felt like a rebirth, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light could find a way. But this world was not content with letting us pass without exacting its toll. One night, we were ambushed by what we first thought were other survivors. Desperation had turned them into something else, something barely human. They attacked with a ferocity that spoke of madness, driven by the belief that the Titans were gods, sent to purge the unworthy. The battle was brutal, a dance of violence that left us shaken, our number diminished but our resolve hardened. Mara was injured during the skirmish, a wound that seemed minor at first, but quickly proved to be anything but. In this new world, even the smallest cut could be a death sentence. We watched over her, a vigil marked by whispered prayers to deities we no longer believed in, hoping for a miracle that never came. When she passed, it was a silent affair, her last breath a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all our lost hopes. We buried her among the ruins, a small act of defiance against the chaos that sought to claim us. Her grave was marked with a piece of rubble, upon which we etched her name. It was a monument not just to her, but to all of us, a testament to our struggle, our pain, and our unwavering will to survive. With heavy hearts, we continued our journey, the haven no longer just a destination but a promise that Mara's death would not be in vain, that her spirit would guide us through the darkest hours. The closer we got to the haven, the more the world seemed to push back, as if it sensed our burgeoning hope and sought to crush it. The Titans became a constant shadow, their presence a reminder of our fragility. But we pressed on, driven by the memory of those we had lost, by the hope of a future where humanity could rise from the ashes of its own despair. The horizon teased us with the promise of safety, the haven a beacon in the relentless darkness that had enveloped the world. Each step towards it was laden with the weight of our journey, our losses, and the thin shred of hope that had kept us moving through the desolate landscape. The city's ruins lay behind us, a testament to the cataclysm that had reshaped our existence. Ahead salvation, or so we believed. As we neared the haven, the environment began to change. The oppressive presence of the Titans receded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed almost unnatural after the constant threat of annihilation. It was as if we were moving through a bubble, an oasis untouched by the chaos that reigned beyond its unseen borders. The entrance to the haven was unassuming, a mere gap in the remnants of what once had been a fortified wall. We entered with bated breath, the anticipation of safety mingling with the unease that had become our constant companion. What we found within was not the sanctuary we had envisioned. The haven was alive, yes, but not with the bustling activity of survivors banding together to rebuild amidst the apocalypse. Instead, it throbbed with a palpable sense of dread, the air thick with the stench of decay. Buildings that had appeared intact from a distance were revealed to be facades, their interiors gutted, filled with the remnants of those who had come before us, seeking refuge and finding only despair. It dawned on us then, with a horror that clutched at our throats, that the haven was a trap, a lure used to draw in survivors not to save them, but to use them. The realization hit me like a physical blow, sending a ripple of panic through our ranks. We were not alone. From the shadows emerged figures, their movements too deliberate to be human. They were the remnants of survivors, twisted by some unspeakable horror into something other, something that existed between life and death. Their eyes, devoid of sanity, fixed on us with a hunger that chilled my blood. The truth of the haven unraveled before us in a tapestry of horror. It was a feeding ground, a place where hope was harvested like a crop by those who had turned to darkness to survive. They worshipped the Titans, believing that by sacrificing others, they could appease the giants and carve out a semblance of existence beneath their notice. Our group was fractured in an instant, torn between the instinct to flee and the futile urge to fight. The creatures descended upon us, their humanity lost to a maddening desire to serve their gods, the Titans. I fought with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. Every strike driven by the memories of those we had lost, every cry a testament to the betrayal of our hopes. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the leader, a figure who stood apart, orchestrating the madness with a calm that was more terrifying than the violence that surrounded him. Our eyes met, and in his gaze, I saw the depth of the abyss into which humanity had plunged. He was the architect of this horror, a man who had chosen to embrace the darkness rather than fight it. The battle raged, a blur of violence and terror, until a sudden, deafening silence enveloped us. The ground trembled, not with the footsteps of the Titans, but with something far more profound. The haven itself seemed to pause, the air charged with a preternatural anticipation. Then it appeared, a Titan, drawn by the crescendo of our despair. Its arrival was not the salvation we had been led to believe, but the culmination of the haven's purpose. The leader stepped forward, arms raised in worship, as the Titan's shadow fell over us, a darkness so complete it threatened to erase all that remained of our humanity. In that moment, as the Titan loomed, a revelation pierced the darkness. The true horror was not the giants that walked the earth, but the darkness within us, the willingness to sacrifice others in the vain hope of survival. The haven was a mirror, reflecting the monstrous depths to which humanity could sink. As the Titan moved, its indifference to the worship, it received a final damning judgment. The haven was consumed, not by salvation, but by annihilation. In its wake, a silence fell, a void where hope had once lived. I escaped, but the haven's lesson remained with me, a scar upon my soul. The world outside continued, indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded within the haven's walls. I walked away from the ruins, not as a survivor, but as a witness to the eclipse of humanity, a darkness that swallowed not just the light of hope, but the very essence of what it means to be human. That's a wrap for today on the Midnight Mystery. Hope you guys had as much fun as we did. If you liked what you saw, hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Oh, and don't be shy. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or any cool mystery ideas you want us to check out. Until next time, we'll see you in the next Midnight Mystery.